Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. He was a wraith in worn denim, his face a landscape of exhaustion and deep-set paranoia. The first thing I noticed about him were his eyes. They never stopped moving, darting from the dark tree line to the rearview mirror, then to the side windows, then back again. But he wasn't looking at things. He was watching the spaces between things. He seemed to be tracking the invisible lines that connected the falling rain to the wet asphalt, the swaying pines to the wind that moved them. He looked like a man who was being hunted not by something behind him, but by the very architecture of reality itself. He gave his name as Frank and said he was heading east. No particular destination. Just away, he'd said, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. It took nearly an hour of shared silence, the only sound the hypnotic rhythm of the tires on wet asphalt, before he finally turned to me, his gaze for once steady and filled with a terrible ancient grief, and decided to unburden himself. Part 1. The Man on the Mountain Road. Have you ever had a job that required you to be alone? Truly, profoundly alone? Frank began, his voice a low, gravelly thing, the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry riverbed. He stared out the windshield into the rushing darkness, but his focus was 1,000 yards and 20 years away. I don't mean the loneliness of a quiet office after everyone's gone home, or an empty house on a Sunday afternoon. I mean the kind of elemental solitude you can only find deep in the wild places of this country. A silence so complete and so loud, it fundamentally changes the shape of your thoughts. For 5 years, I was a U.S. Forest Service ranger, a fire lookout mostly. It's a job they don't have much use for anymore, not with satellites and drones. But back then, it was still a noble calling. I spent my summers in a 10 by 10 foot room on stilts, 60 feet above the floor of the Conexu National Forest in the Idaho Panhandle. My only job was to watch, to be the solitary, vigilant eye in a 3 million acre sea of green, waiting for the first wisp of smoke, the first sign of disaster. He described that life with a painful, almost bitter nostalgia, the way a man might describe a love that nearly destroyed him. He spoke of the immense, crushing beauty of it, a beauty that bordered on a kind of sublime terror. The way the sun would rise and set, painting the endless canopy of trees in impossible hues of gold and blood and bruised purple. The sound of the wind, a constant sighing companion that whispered a language he almost thought he could understand. The feeling of being the only sentient, thinking human being for 50 miles in any direction, a tiny, fragile bubble of consciousness in a vast, indifferent wilderness. He was younger then, he said, 26 years old, and filled with a kind of cynical, self-congratulatory pride. He was a pragmatist, a man who believed in maps, in weather patterns, in the observable, repeatable, comforting laws of nature. He dealt in facts. Soil moisture content, wind speed, lightning strike data, fuel load. He had no time for the ghost stories or the local folklore the old-timers in town would spin. He thought the silence of the forest was empty. He was catastrophically wrong. This happened in my 3rd season up there, he continued, his hands, which had been resting calmly on his thighs, now clenching slightly into fists. It was late September, the end of the season. The tourists were gone. The air had turned sharp and cold, and the storms had started to roll in. Not the quick, violent thunderstorms of summer, but the real storms, the kind that feel different, older, more serious. The kind of relentless, cold rain that means winter is coming to kill the world again. They were pulling me from the lookout tower the next morning. I was driving my government-issue pickup truck down the mountain, taking the old Northern Ridge Service Road. It's a treacherous bastard of a road, more of a controlled rock slide than a path, especially in the rain. And this storm was biblical. The rain was coming down in solid gray sheets that turned the world into a blur, and the wind was making the old-growth pines around me groan like dying giants. The world had shrunk to just the frantic, desperate slap of my windshield wipers and the 2 weak cones of my headlights, pushing back against a solid wall of night. He was halfway down the mountain, at least an hour's hard drive from the nearest paved road, miles from anything that could be called civilization, when he saw him. It was the last thing in the universe I expected to see on that road. At that time of night, in that kind of weather. A man, just standing on the muddy shoulder, beside a sheer, weeping rock face. He wasn't trying to flag me down. He wasn't huddled against the rain. He wasn't even looking at me. He was just standing there, his head tilted up toward the sky as if listening to something, his face completely unnervingly placid, as the rain plastered his thin shirt to his bones. Frank, being a ranger and duty-bound to assist anyone in the forest, had pulled over, his mind racing. He was cautious. No one should have been up here. No civilian vehicle could have made it up this road in this weather, and all the other service personnel in the district were accounted for. This was an anomaly, a serious one. The man who got into his truck was strange in every conceivable way. He was thin, emaciated even, with a gaunt, ascetic look, yet he moved with a serene, unhurried grace that was completely at odds with the violent storm. He was soaked to the skin, but he didn't seem to be shivering or even cold. His eyes were the most peculiar thing about him. They were a pale, washed-out, almost translucent blue, and they were utterly, profoundly calm. It was the calm of a deep lake on a windless day, the kind of absolute stillness that suggests an immense, hidden depth. "Thanks for the ride, Frank," the man had said as he slid into the passenger seat, his voice quiet and melodic, a strange and gentle sound amidst the howl of the storm. "The first real alarm bell went off in my head," Frank told me, his own eyes darting to my face for a moment, as if to make sure I understood the gravity of this detail. I wasn't wearing a name tag. My truck had no markings identifying me personally. It was just a standard green Forest Service pickup. There was no way he could have known my name. I asked him, my voice sharper than I intended. "How did you know my name?" The man had just smiled, a small, gentle, infinitely sad smile that didn't quite reach his calm eyes. "The wind told me you were coming," he'd said, a statement that should have been poetic nonsense, but in that moment, in that truck, it felt less like a riddle and more like a simple statement of a law of physics Frank had never learned. The man said his name was Jonah. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the storm raging outside, Frank's mind trying to solve the puzzle of this man. He was on edge, his hand resting near the heavy maglite on his center console. He asked Jonah what he was doing up here in the middle of a national forest in a typhoon. Jonah replied with that same unnerving calm that he had been observing. When Frank, annoyed, asked what he was observing, Jonah simply said, "The patterns, the way things connect." I was about to ask him what the hell that was supposed to mean, Frank said, his voice dropping low, becoming thick with the memory, when he turned to me, his calm blue eyes holding mine, and said, with no hint of alarm or urgency, "You should slow down now, Frank, considerably." I asked him why. The road ahead was clear as far as I could see in my headlights. "The big oak," he said, his voice a simple, declarative statement. "The old one that leans out over the road at mile marker 7. The third lightning strike from this particular cloud cell will catch it just right. The roots are rotten from the inside out due to a specific fungal growth. It'll fall across the road about a minute before we get there. It'll make quite a mess." Frank had scoffed. It was an absurdly, insanely specific prediction. He knew that oak. It was a landmark. It had been leaning over that road for 100 years. Still, something in Jonah's absolute, unwavering certainty unnerved him. Against his better judgment, against all his pragmatic training, he slowed the truck down to a crawl, rounding the next few treacherous bends with an unfamiliar caution. As they approached the turn where the ancient oak stood, a brilliant, blue-white fork of lightning lit up the entire mountainside, followed an instant later by a thunderclap so loud it shook the truck to its frame. Then a second bolt struck the ridge above them, closer this time. Frank held his breath, his hands clenched on the wheel. A third fork of lightning, brighter and more violent than the others, seemed to walk right down the sky and struck the ancient oak with a deafening crack. There was a sound like a rifle shot, followed by a deep, groaning, tearing sound of immense weight and history giving way. When Frank rounded the final bend, his headlights fell upon a massive, splintered, impassable wall of ancient wood and tangled branches, completely blocking the road. The old oak had fallen, exactly as Jonah had said it would, It had missed them by less than a minute. Frank put the truck in park, his heart hammering in his chest like a trapped animal, and turned to stare at the strange, calm man beside him. Jonah was just watching the rain on the window, his expression placid, as if he had just commented on a passing cloud. "It's a lovely, intricate pattern, isn't it?" Jonah said softly, his voice full of a quiet, academic appreciation. "The storm, the lightning, the rotten wood, the precise timing of our arrival, all the pieces fitting together just so." Part 2. The shape of things to come. The sight of the fallen oak tree, 100 tons of wood and history lying exactly where Jonah had predicted it would lie, had shattered the neat, orderly, predictable world in Frank's head. As a man of logic and reason, his mind immediately began scrambling for an explanation. Any explanation that did not involve the supernatural. Coincidence? It was a possibility, but the sheer specificity of the prediction, the third strike, the rotten roots, the timing, stretched the definition of coincidence to its breaking point. Had Jonah somehow sabotaged the tree himself and waited for the storm, a madman playing a complex and dangerous prank? None of it made any sense. The sheer, calm certainty with which Jonah had spoken was what unnerved him the most. It wasn't the wild-eyed fervor of a lunatic or a prophet. It was the quiet, dispassionate confidence of an engineer reading a blueprint, of a mathematician solving a known equation. "We had to backtrack for nearly an hour," Frank continued, his voice still holding a phantom echo of his younger self's frustration and dawning disbelief. "Find a different, even worse logging road to get down the mountain." The detour added hours to the drive. And in that time, in the dark, swaying cab of that Ford pickup, with the storm howling outside like a hungry beast, he started to explain. Or at least he tried. He tried to explain the impossible. Jonah had explained patiently that he wasn't a psychic. He hated that word. It was imprecise, vulgar. Psychics, he said, claim to see flashes of a mutable, uncertain future, dreamlike glimpses of what might be. They saw possibilities. What he saw was different. He didn't have visions. He perceived the intricate, invisible scaffolding of cause and effect that underpins all of reality. He saw the mathematical certainty of the next moment, and the moment after that, and the moment after that, stretching away from the present into infinity like a perfectly structured crystal. He called it seeing the shape of things, Frank recalled, rubbing his tired eyes as if the memory itself were a bright, painful light. He tried to explain it to me in terms I, a simple ranger, might understand. He said, "Imagine you're watching a single drop of rain fall from a great height. To you, it is a random event. You can't possibly know where it will land. But imagine if you could see everything else. Imagine if you could see the exact shape of the wind, the precise barometric pressure, the humidity, the gravitational pull of the earth, the angle of the roof it will strike, the granular texture of the asphalt shingle it will hit. If you could see all of those invisible forces and factors at once, you wouldn't have to guess where it would bounce. You would know. It would be a simple matter of calculation. That's what I see, Frank. All the invisible forces all at once, for everything in the universe." Frank, ever the skeptic, even in the face of the impossible, had pushed back, arguing from his college physics textbook. I told him that was impossible. The universe is chaos at its core. Quantum mechanics, the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg. You can't know everything. The very act of observing changes the outcome. Jonah had simply smiled that sad, patient, weary smile again. "You're thinking of it on the wrong scale," he'd replied softly. "The quantum world is chaotic because it's the engine room. It's the place where the possibilities are generated, where the dice are thrown. But once those possibilities coalesce and lock into the macro world, our world, the patterns become rigid. The equation is already written and solved. Most people only see the answer. The car crashes, the flower blooms, the star goes supernova. I see the whole formula, all the variables, all the steps leading to the inevitable conclusion. What you call the present is just the bleeding edge of a past that has already been finalized." To prove his point, to demonstrate the terrible, soul-crushing certainty of his sight, he began to narrate the immediate future in small, terrifyingly mundane detail. "In 10 seconds, Jonah would say, his voice a calm, dispassionate monotone, A gust of wind from the southwest, traveling at precisely 15 miles per hour, will hit the third pine tree on your left, about halfway up. It will dislodge a small, loose piece of bark, which will fall and strike a beetle that is crawling on the branch below. The beetle will take flight in panic and be caught in the same gust of wind, which will carry it directly into the path of our truck. It will hit the windshield just to the left of the driver's side wiper, at a height of 4 feet 2 inches from the ground. It will leave a small yellow smudge. Frank had gripped the wheel, counting the seconds under his breath, his eyes fixed on the tree, his heart pounding. And exactly as Jonah had described, a tiny dark speck had suddenly appeared out of the rainy darkness, tumbled through the air in his headlights, and impacted the windshield with a faint but distinct tick. Frank had slammed on the brakes, stopped the truck in the middle of the muddy road, gotten out with his flashlight, and stared at the small yellow insectoid smudge on the glass until the rain washed it away. He got back in the truck, his hands shaking so badly he could barely put it in gear. This happened again and again over the next hour. Jonah would calmly describe the intricate chain of causality that would lead to a specific, fist-sized rock, breaking loose from a high, waterlogged outcrop and tumbling down onto the road ahead of them, forcing Frank to swerve at the last possible second. He would describe the precise moment a frightened doe, startled by a coyote hunting a mile away, would dart across the road between two specific lightning-scarred trees. He wasn't seeing the future in a magical sense. He was reading the present with an impossible, terrifying, godlike clarity. The worst part, Frank told me, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper, was that he said it was a curse. He described the experience of his sight as a constant, deafening, soul-destroying roar of information. He saw the patterns in everything. He could see the slow, inexorable, predictable decay of the cells in my body. He could see the exact trajectory of my own life, my career, my eventual lonely death from heart failure at the age of 73. He saw the microscopic stress fractures in the truck's axle, the inevitable failure of the transmission in 2 years and 3 months' time. He said living with the sight was like trying to listen to a single, quiet conversation in a room where 1 million televisions were all blaring different channels at once. He couldn't turn it off. It was driving him mad. The only peace he ever found was in moments of true, unadulterated, unpredictable human chaos, which he said were becoming rarer and rarer in our increasingly orderly world. Frank had finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind for hours, the question that was now burning in mine. Where did he get this ability? Was he born with it? Had something happened to him? Jonah's serene, placid expression had finally, completely broken. A look of profound, soul-deep pain had crossed his features, the look of a man bearing an impossible weight. "I wasn't born with it," he said, his voice trembling for the very first time, the calm lake of his eyes suddenly stirred by a storm of grief. "It's a duty. It's a family curse, and it's tied to a specific place. A place I have just fled. A place on top of this very mountain." Part 3. The Stellicope and the Silent Watchers. The truck's cabin, which had felt like a small, safe metal refuge from the raging storm outside, now felt like a cage, an isolation chamber where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. I was locked inside with a man whose reality seemed to be actively leaking into mine, poisoning it with impossible, terrifying truths. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, of pine needles, of ozone from the nearby lightning strikes, and a strange electric tension that seemed to emanate from Jonah himself. Frank's story had taken a sharp, dizzying turn from a spooky encounter on a mountain road into something far more vast and cosmic, and I found myself leaning forward, my own hands gripping the wheel of my car tighter, my knuckles white. "He told me his curse was hereditary," Frank said, his gaze distant, lost in the memory of Jonah's pained, whispered confession. "But not in the way you'd think of a genetic trait, like blue eyes or baldness. It wasn't just in his blood. He said it was tied to a specific place, a geographical locus of power, he called it. An axis mundi, a place where the rules were different, and it was on the summit of the very mountain we were trying to get down from. The old abandoned Cold Springs Observatory." I, Jack, felt a jolt of recognition at the name, a cold finger tracing its way down my spine. The Cold Springs Observatory. I'd heard whispers of that place from other travelers of the night, other stories told in hushed, fearful tones. An old abandoned government facility built in the 50s, shut down under mysterious classified circumstances in the late 1960s. The official story was that it was an atmospheric research station, a place for studying weather balloons and the ionosphere. But the local legends, the kind of tales you hear on this channel if you listen long enough, were much darker. They spoke of strange, silent men in black cars on the mountain roads at night, of a secret underground component to the facility, of a place that was built to look at something that wasn't in our sky at all. Frank confirmed that the legends were closer to the truth than the official records. Jonah just laughed when I said it was a government facility, he recounted, his lips twisting in a bitter, mirthless smile. It was a hollow, broken sound. The government didn't build it, he told me. They just co-opted it for a while before they got scared and ran away. My great-great-grandfather built it. He then told me the incredible, tragic story of his family. He called them the Silent Watchers. For over 150 years, since the time this part of the country was true wilderness, his family had been the secret, solitary caretakers of the observatory and its main terrible instrument, an instrument he called the stelloscope. Jonah's ancestors, he had explained to Frank, were not your typical pioneers or prospectors. They were a strange, reclusive, wealthy family of European immigrants, intellectuals, freethinkers, amateur astronomers, and mystics who were obsessed with the nascent field of astrophysics, but also with far older, more esoteric ideas about the nature of the cosmos. They believed the universe wasn't just a clockwork mechanism that could be understood through mathematics alone, but a living, thinking entity, and that its deepest secrets couldn't just be measured, they had to be perceived directly. They chose that specific mountain peak in the remote wilds of Idaho for a very specific reason. There was something unique about the geology, a strange concentration of quartz and other crystalline minerals. There was something unique about the atmosphere, the magnetic fields. It was, Jonah had said, a place where the veil between what is and what seems to be was unusually thin. They built the observatory by hand over the course of a decade, a marvel of brass and granite and hand-ground lenses, a testament to their brilliance and their obsession. But the stelloscope, its primary instrument, was their masterpiece and their damnation. He told me it wasn't designed to look at the stars, Frank said, leaning forward in my passenger seat now, his voice dropping conspiratorially, as if he were afraid the words themselves might be overheard. That's what they told the world, but it was a lie. It was designed to look at the absolute perfect informationless darkness between them. My great-great-grandfather was a man who believed that the true nature of reality wasn't written in the light of the stars, which is just old, dead information, but in the shape of the void itself. He built the stelloscope to see into that void, and it worked. It worked far too well. On a clear, moonless night in the late 1880s, Jonah's ancestor had looked through the strange, crystalline eyepiece of his creation, and he hadn't seen nothing. He had seen everything. He had seen the fundamental structure of the universe, the shimmering geometric scaffolding of space-time, the intricate flowing dance of all causality from the beginning of time to its end. He had seen the shape of things. And the sight, the sheer influx of absolute perfect knowledge, had shattered his mind even as it enlightened him. He had been the first watcher. The ability, the terrible curse, was not passed down through genetics. It was passed down through the act of observation itself. To look through the eyepiece of the stelloscope, Jonah explained, was to have your brain's neural pathways forcibly, permanently rewired to perceive the underlying pattern of reality. It was an irreversible cognitive recalibration. The watcher's terrible secret duty, passed from one generation to the next, was to have one member of the family always on duty at the observatory, always observing, always mapping the ever-present, ever-changing shape of things. Why? Frank remembered asking him, his voice full of his younger self's incredulity. What was the point of just watching? What could they possibly do with that kind of knowledge? Jonah's face, which had been animated in the telling of his family's history, had suddenly grown dark, his expression shadowed with a cosmic despair so profound it seemed too large for a single human being to contain. At first, my ancestors thought it was a path to understanding God, he'd said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They thought they were charting the mind of the creator. But after decades of meticulous, painstaking observation, my grandfather, who was a brilliant mathematician, discovered the truth. They weren't just mapping the structure of reality. They were charting its slow, orderly, inevitable death. The true duty of the watcher wasn't to understand the universe. It was to bear witness to its end. Part 4. The Great Unraveling. The storm outside the truck had begun to subside, the violent, percussive drumming of the rain easing into a soft, hissing lament. But inside the cab, the storm in my own mind was just beginning to gather force, Frank said, his narrative now so immersive that I could almost feel the cold dampness of that long-ago night. He paused, and in the fleeting rhythmic light of a passing car on the other side of the highway, I could see the profound, haunted look in his eyes. He was no longer just telling a story. He was reliving a sermon, the terrifying sermon that had utterly destroyed his faith in a sane and rational world. Jonah started to describe what he and his family had been watching through that terrible lens for over a century, Frank continued, his voice a low, horrified murmur, as if he were afraid of the words themselves. He said the end of the universe wasn't going to be a big crunch or a big rip, the way the physicists on TV talk about it. It wasn't going to be a sudden, dramatic, fiery cataclysm. There was no chaos, no violence, no grand finale. It was something far more subtle and far more terrifying. He called it the Great Unraveling, or in the old family ledgers, the Great Silence. And the most horrific part of all, the part that truly broke his mind, was that it was moving backward through time. I remember my younger self asking him, my brain still clutching at the comforting straws of linear time, how something could possibly move backward through time. It didn't make sense. Jonah had looked at me with those ancient, pitying eyes, the eyes of a man explaining color to someone born blind. Time isn't a river, he'd said, his voice soft and sad. That's a comforting, simple metaphor we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, but it's wrong. Time is a fixed object, a four-dimensional crystal, if you like. Every moment that has ever been, and every moment that ever will be already exists, simultaneously, locked together in a single, vast, static structure. What we perceive as the flow of time, the present, is just our consciousness moving through that crystal, experiencing its facets one by one. But the crystal itself is whole and complete. The end of the universe, the absolute zero of existence, the final heat death where all matter and energy and meaning ceases to be, already exists. It is the final facet, the end of the crystal. And it is not passive. It is an active entropic force, a tide of pure, silent, featureless nothingness. And its influence, its stain, is spreading, not forward into a future that doesn't exist, but backward from that final moment, erasing the past. He described what the watchers saw through the strange lens of the stelloscope. They saw the shimmering, infinite, geometric pattern of all causality, all of existence, as a vast, glowing web of light. And at the far end of it, the place that corresponded to the heat death of the universe, they saw the unraveling. It wasn't a destructive force. It didn't shatter or break the glowing threads of the pattern. It simply erased them. A thread of causality, the life of a star, the history of a planet, the love affair of two people, would be there one moment, glowing with the light of its own internal logic and meaning, and the next moment it would just be gone, winked out of existence, leaving a patch of absolute, perfect, informationless blackness in its place. One by one, the threads of existence were being unwritten from the book of creation. He said this great silence, this unraveling, was erasing not just life and matter. Frank's voice trembled with the remembered horror of the concept, the words catching in his throat. It was erasing the very laws that governed them. It was erasing memory. It was erasing meaning. As the tide of nothingness moved backward through the crystal of time, it was simplifying the universe, deleting complexity, undoing creation itself, turning poetry into prose, and prose into noise, and noise into silence. He said that's why the ancient past seems so mythic and strange to us, why miracles and magic seem to have ceased. It's because the universe was genuinely more complex then, more chaotic, more magical. The unraveling hadn't reached that far back into the crystal yet. The world is getting quieter, more predictable, more boring, because it is literally, actively, being erased and rewritten into a simpler, dumber state by the encroaching absolute void at its end. The Watcher's terrible secret duty, Jonah had explained, was not just to observe this cosmic decay with a detached scientific horror. It was to try and slow it down. It was a fool's errand, a hopeless battle, but it was their duty. They had discovered over decades of observation that the unraveling moved fastest through the parts of the pattern that were orderly, predictable, logical, and simple. It fed on certainty, but it seemed to be slowed, even momentarily repelled, by moments of true, unadulterated, unpredictable chaos and meaning. He called them anchor, Frank said, the word sounding both hopeful and tragic. Moments of pure, complex, unpredictable life that were so potent with meaning, they acted as breakwaters against the tide. A truly selfless act of sacrifice for another. A spontaneous, world-changing work of art born from a moment of pure inspiration. A moment of pure, unreasoning, unconditional love. A madman's beautiful, impossible, world-changing dream. These moments, he said, were so complex and so full of unpredictable, uncalculable meaning that they acted like boulders in the stream of the unraveling, forcing the tide of nothingness to flow around them, preserving the part of the universal pattern that lay behind them for just a little while longer. The Watcher's true, secret job was to use the stelloscope to find these potential anchors in the timeline, to identify the people and places that could generate them, and sometimes, if they were desperate, to try and secretly nudge the world in a way that might create one, to be subtle, anonymous patrons of chaos and art and love. But they were failing. Jonah had confessed this with a voice choked with a despair so absolute it was terrifying to witness. For every anchor they could identify, 1,000,000 years of the pattern would be erased. The tide of silence was accelerating. The universe was getting simpler, quieter, emptier, faster and faster. And he, Jonah, the latest in the long, tragic line of Watchers, could no longer bear the weight of it. To see the sublime, beautiful, intricate pattern of all existence and to simultaneously watch it being methodically, inexorably, silently, erased. It had finally broken him. He told me he'd been at his post for a decade, Frank whispered, his voice cracking. 10 years of staring into that lens, of watching the slow, orderly, silent death of everything. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't be the priest of a church dedicated to the heat death of meaning. He had fled his post at the observatory just that morning. He had walked out into the storm, with no plan, no destination, just a desperate, overwhelming human need to tell someone, to make the secret known, to make someone else understand that the silence was coming for us all, and that in a way, it was already here. Part 5. The Lens of Emptiness. The weight of Jonah's confession settled in the cab of the truck, a thing of immense cosmological gravity that seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. He was no longer just a strange man with an uncanny predictive ability. He was a priest of a dying universe, a refugee from a truth so vast and terrible it dwarfed every human concern, every joy, every sorrow, every war, every love story. I, Frank, a simple man who a few hours ago was concerned only with road conditions and closing up his fire tower for the season, was now burdened with the knowledge of the imminent and inevitable erasure of all meaning. A part of me, the rational, pragmatic ranger who still clung desperately to the wreckage of my worldview, was screaming that this man was brilliantly, poetically insane, that the storm and the isolation and the stress were getting to me. But the other part, the part that had seen the ancient oak tree fall at the exact predicted moment, that had seen the beetle hit the glass, knew with a cold, sinking, soul-deep certainty that he was telling the absolute, horrifying truth. He asked me to do something then, Frank told me, his voice now barely a whisper, as if he were afraid the memory itself might hear him and awaken. He asked me to do the one thing I knew I shouldn't. He asked me to drive him back up the mountain, back to the observatory. He needed to show me. He said he couldn't carry the terrible burden alone anymore, that after so long in solitude, he was starting to think he had imagined it all, that he had finally gone mad like so many of his ancestors before him. He needed a witness. He needed a fresh pair of eyes. He needed someone else to look through the lens and verify the horror, to tell him he wasn't alone in his terrible world-ending knowledge. My younger self had refused, vehemently, violently. A primal instinct for mental self-preservation had kicked in. I told him I'd drive him down the mountain to the nearest town, to a hospital, to a police station, wherever he wanted to go. I would help him, but I was not going back up there. I was not going to that abandoned, haunted place. But Jonah had been insistent, his usual zen-like calm replaced by a desperate, pleading, almost childlike intensity. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes wild with fear and hope. He said it was the only thing he would ever ask of me, the only way he could ever be free, one way or another. To this day, I don't know why I agreed, Frank said with a slow, painful shake of his head, a gesture of self-loathing that had clearly been repeated thousands of times over the intervening 20 years. Maybe it was pity. He looked so broken, so utterly lost. Maybe it was the ranger in me, that ingrained sense of duty, feeling responsible for this lost soul I had found in my forest. Or maybe, he admitted, his voice full of a deep, resonant shame, it was a terrible, morbid human curiosity, a deep, perverse need to see the one thing that you fear the most, to look into the abyss, just to see if it will look back at you. I was a man who prided himself on believing only in what he could see and measure, and he was offering me a chance to see and measure everything. And so, with a feeling of grim, fatalistic dread, I had turned the truck around and begun the slow, treacherous drive back up the mountain, back toward the Cold Springs Observatory. The journey up was made in a thick, heavy, suffocating silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world shrouded in a thick, damp mist and an eerie, dripping stillness that was somehow more unnerving than the storm's fury. As we neared the summit, the observatory came into view, a skeletal black dome against the bruised, star-flecked post-storm sky. The place was a monument to decay, a perfect circle of wrongness on the mountaintop. And the feeling up here was different. The air itself felt thin and cold and dead, as if the unraveling Jonah spoke of was strongest in this place, its entropy bleeding out into the surrounding world. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was an active, oppressive presence, a physical weight. Jonah led me from the truck to the observatory's main entrance, the heavy, riveted iron doors groaning open under his touch, as if they recognized their master. Inside, the place was a wreck, abandoned for decades. Dust lay thick on everything like a layer of fine gray snow. The air was frigid and smelled of rust, damp concrete, and cold stone. He led me through the darkness, up a winding wrought iron spiral staircase, his steps sure and certain in the gloom, my own hesitant and clumsy. We entered the main observation chamber under the great dome. And there it was, the stelloscope. It was unlike any telescope I had ever seen or read about. It wasn't a sleek, modern white instrument. It was a behemoth of tarnished brass and pitted iron and strange, dark, non-reflective alloys that seemed to drink the light from my flashlight, giving nothing back. It was covered in complex, arcane-looking dials and verniers, and its lenses, its main lens, a great dark thing several feet across, weren't made of glass but of some kind of dark, polished, impossibly smooth crystal that looked like solidified night. It didn't point up at the sky through the dome's open shutter. It seemed to be aimed at a strange, indeterminate point in space, as if it were looking at a hole in the world, a blind spot in the cosmos. It felt less like a scientific instrument and more like a sacred, terrible, sacrificial altar. "This is it," Jonah breathed, his hand resting on the cold metal of the stelloscope with a strange mixture of familial reverence and profound revulsion. The lens that broke my family, the window to the great silence. He turned to me, his calm blue eyes now streaming with hot, silent tears, his decades of composure completely, utterly gone. He was just a broken, terrified man at the end of his rope. "Please, Frank," he wept, his voice cracking, his hands shaking. "I just need you to look, just for a second. That's all it takes. Just 1 second to see it, to tell me I'm not crazy. Please, just tell me that it's real." I stood there frozen, my heart a block of ice in my chest. Every instinct for self-preservation, every rational thought, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get out of that building, off that mountain, and to never, ever look back. But the pull of the mystery, the terrible, uniquely human need to know the final, ultimate secret of the universe, was stronger. I was a man who only believed what he could see, and he was offering me the truth of everything. Slowly, as if in a dream, my body moving without my consent, I stepped forward. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through deep water. Jonah stepped aside, his face a mask of desperate hope and profound, sorrowful pity. I leaned toward the eyepiece, a cup of polished, cold, black crystal that seemed to hum with a faint, silent vibration. I closed one eye, took a deep, shuddering breath, a final breath in the world I knew, and I looked. Part 6. The Burden of Sight. The moment my eye met the cold crystal lens of the stelloscope, the world dissolved. It wasn't a gradual transition, a fading, or a blurring. It was an instantaneous, violent substitution of one reality for another. One moment, I was a man in a cold, dark room, and the next, I was everywhere. And everywhen. I didn't see stars or galaxies or the familiar, comforting blackness of the night sky. I saw it. The thing I now see every waking and sleeping moment of my life, burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The pattern. It's impossible to describe with words, Frank said, his voice now a hollow, toneless drone. The voice of a man who has seen too much and is now forever changed by it. He was staring at his own faint reflection in the dark passenger window, but his eyes were looking through it, through me, at the memory that was his constant companion. Our language, our brains, they didn't evolve to comprehend it. Imagine the entire universe, all of time and space from the singular moment of the Big Bang to the final frozen end, laid out before you not as a three-dimensional space, but as a four-dimensional object, an equation, a living, breathing, infinitely complex geometric equation made of light. It was a vast, shimmering, endless scaffolding of light, a web of glowing, interconnected threads that crisscrossed and intersected in ways that made my head ache. Every single thread was a line of causality. Every intersection was a moment, an event. I could see the thread of my own life, a tiny, insignificant filament of light, stretching from my birth to my death. I could see the thread of the mountain we were on, of the ancient oak tree that had fallen. I could see the history of the world, of humanity, of life on Earth, of the Earth itself, all laid out, all connected, all woven together into a single, sublime, perfect, terrifyingly beautiful tapestry. He saw it all in a flash that was both instantaneous and eternal. 1 billion years of information, of life and death and change, was poured directly into his brain in less than a single second. He saw the birth of stars in great, glorious clouds of light. He saw the slow, grinding death of ancient civilizations on planets 1 million light-years away. He saw the quiet, mundane, precious moments of 1 trillion lives, all connected, all part of the same flawless, beautiful, inescapable logic. He saw that free will was a comforting illusion, a localized phenomenon that we experience, but that from this vantage point, every choice, every action, every thought was simply the inevitable result of a previous cause. It was beautiful, so beautiful it hurt to look at, a beauty that annihilated the self. And then, he saw the other thing, the thing that made the beauty, a mockery. At the far edge of the tapestry, he whispered, his voice trembling with a remembered, existential dread. At the place that was the end of time, there was the unraveling. The great silence. It was a tide of pure, silent, featureless, perfect nothingness. It wasn't black. Black is a color, a presence. This was the absence of black. It was the absence of everything. And it was moving, flowing slowly backward through the pattern, like a stain of bleach spreading on a photograph. And as it touched the glowing threads of causality, they didn't break or shatter or explode. They simply ceased to be. They were erased. One by one, the threads of existence were being unwritten from the book of creation. I watched 1 billion years of history, the entire life of a spiral galaxy, just vanish. Not destroyed, just gone, as if it had never been. The silence wasn't just coming for the future, it was unmaking what had already happened. The vision, the understanding, the sheer crushing cosmic scale of it shattered his psyche. He screamed, a raw animal sound of pure abject terror, a sound he ripped from the deepest part of his soul, and stumbled back from the stelloscope, falling hard onto the cold stone floor of the observatory. He scrambled away from the terrible instrument, crab-walking backward on his hands and feet like a frightened animal, his mind a fractured, screaming mess of after-images and impossible, unbearable knowledge. He lay there on the floor, weeping and shaking and babbling, for how long he didn't know, minutes or hours. Time had ceased to have any meaning. When he finally managed to pull himself together, to push the terrible, blinding vision to the back of his mind and regain a sliver of his sanity, he found that the observatory was silent and empty. Jonah was gone. He had vanished into the night. At first, Frank thought, in his confused state, that Jonah had simply left him there, had abandoned him in his moment of crisis. But then, as Frank's own frantic thoughts began to quieten, he noticed something new. A new sound in his own head. A low, constant, underlying hum. The background noise of the universe. And when he opened his eyes and looked around the dome, he could see it. With his naked, unprotected eyes, he could see the faint, shimmering gossamer lines of causality in the air around him. He could see the intricate, geometric pattern in the way the dust motes danced in a stray moonbeam. He could see the inevitable path of a single drop of water as it ran down the curved stone wall of the dome. He understood the horrifying truth then. The stelloscope didn't just show you the pattern. It acted as a tuning fork for the human mind. It vibrated your consciousness, your very soul, until it resonated with the fundamental frequency of the universe itself. It gave you the sight, a permanent, irreversible perceptual upgrade that was also a curse. Jonah hadn't needed a witness. He had needed a replacement. He had needed to pass the burden on. And Frank had accepted it willingly. That was 20 years ago, Frank said, his story finally mercifully coming to its desolate end. I am a watcher now. Or what's left of one. I see the patterns in everything. The world is a deafening, constant roar of cause and effect. I see the shape of people's lives when I look at them, the sad, predictable, immutable arcs of their joys and their sorrows. It's why I can't be around people for long. It's too loud, and I see the unraveling. Every day the world is a little bit quieter, a little bit simpler, a little bit more faded than it was the day before. The silence is coming for us all. I see it in the growing static on a dead radio channel, in the blandness of modern art, in the predictable, recycled plots of movies and television shows. The complexity, the magic, the meaning, it's all draining out of the world. He finally turned from the window and looked at me, a deep, sorrowful pity in his ancient eyes. I'm telling you this, Jack, for one reason. I'm tired. I'm so tired of watching. Maybe if I tell the story, if I make someone else understand, truly understand what is at stake, it will quiet the noise in my own head for a little while. Or maybe, he added, a new, chilling, ambiguous possibility entering his voice. Some stories are like the stelloscope. Maybe they're just another way to pass the burden on. A way to tune the listener. I drove him to an all-night diner an hour later, a lonely island of buzzing neon light in the vast darkness. He got out of the car. He looked back at me one last time. Be careful what you listen to in the quiet, Jack, he said. Then he turned and walked into the diner, and for a split second, under the flickering fluorescent light, I thought I saw the shimmering, ghostly lines of 100 possible paths branching out before him, and the single dark, inevitable one he was fated to walk. I drove away, back into the night. The road ahead was slick with rain, the white lines pulling me forward into the darkness. But the world looked different now. The falling rain no longer seemed random. It seemed to have a rhythm, a purpose, a structure I had never noticed before. Troubled, I turned on my radio, searching for a human voice, a song, anything to break the spell. But all I could find was static, and for the first time in my life I thought I could hear a faint, structured, terrifyingly logical pattern hidden deep within it, and I wondered if Frank had just given me a story, or if he had given me a curse. And if you listen closely enough to these tales, to the silence between the words, you might just start to see the pattern too.